Tuesday. Thank you all for joining. My name is Katie Rose Watson, and I'm the founder of the food and garden website at therosetable.com. And I am joined by Rose legend, Paul Zimmerman. Paul, thank you so much for doing this today.
Absolutely. Hi, everybody.
We are so excited to join Jackson and Perkins for a Spring Guide for Growing Roses webinar series. This is actually the first webinar in a 3-part series. So today we are mainly going to be discussing how to plant new roses, and Paul's going to give us all sorts of amazing tips to really get growing this spring. So Paul, I'm excited about spring gardening. How about you?
I am too. I'm always excited about spring. It's just, the gardens start to wake up and they leaf out and the roses come in. And I've got a lot of the old roses that are spring flowering roses. And, they flower for about 4 or 5 weeks in spring. They don't see them for another year. So for me, it's like greeting new friends, old frifriends again, that'll be coming out. So I'm excited about all that stuff. It's just such a happy time.
I love that. And
yeah.
You are just such an incredible gardener. Paul has a YouTube channel that you all need to go subscribe to right now because he has the most amazing tips and informative videos about rose growing. I so enjoy it, Paul. So really excited to
Thank you
today.
Also, a lot of stuff on my website. All the 2 YouTube videos and a lot of articles I've written are all on my website, which is just paulzimmermanroses.com. But it's all kind of grouped by subject. If you want to learn by pruning, there's a section on that, and working with climbing roses. So just all kinds of stuff that I've sort of, thrown out there over the years.
Awesome. I love it. So let's talk first. What makes spring one of the best times to plant roses, and why is it so important to get roots off to a good start?
Well, spring is good because the ground is starting to warm up. It starts to wake up a little bit, particularly if you live in like a moderate climate. The rose can settle in. It's also in spring because a lot of roses are sold bare root. That's when your selection is usually the largest as well.
Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned with roots, though, that is the most important thing. Roots first, top second. You want to get a good root system established before you start worrying about the top. So I know we'll get into fertilizer a little bit more in a little bit, but that's a real important aspect of what we're talking about, because the top of the rose can only be supported by as much as the root system. So if the root system is small and the top is big, the rose is going to suffer. So that's why you want to make sure you get that root system going.
And now you mentioned bare root. Can you explain more what that means for anyone watching to buy a bare root versus a container rose?
Yeah, so basically it's going to be the same rose at the end of the day. The difference is how it comes to you. So a bare root rose is essentially a rose where the roots are exposed. There's no soil on the rose at all. They'll come wrapped in a plastic bag. They'll be moist inside the bag and things along those lines. And you got to treat those a little differently. A container rose arrives in a pot. So it's got a root system that's actively growing. It's got a root ball, soil that's inside the pot as well. So that's the main difference between the two of them. One has soil, one does not.
And like you mentioned, you really get such a wider variety if you consider getting a bare root rose. We both love to order from Jackson Perkins, and so many people ask where I get so many of my specialty roses. So do you see any difference in your garden in terms of performance, getting a bare root versus a container, or not so much?
Not so much, no. What you will hear sometimes, because a lot of the container roses are what's called own root. And the difference there is a lot of roses are budded or grafted. The two terms are interchangeable. And grafted onto an understock. Dr. Yui's the most popular one in the United States. An own root rose, you stick a cutting, so the root system is the same as the rose above the ground. Pluses and minuses, and we can have a huge, probably the whole program on nothing but that. And
we'll do that this summer.
We will, yeah. We'll have both sides of the fence. But essentially, it's not. The difference is generally a bare root rose is about 2 to 2.5 years old by the time you get it. It's a more mature plant. Own root roses tend to be a little bit younger. So there's a difference in the time it takes to establish in the garden. A bare root rose will generally establish a little bit quicker. At the end of the day, it makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. They're both going to be fine.
Interesting. What do you feel like are some of the most common mistakes that people make when planting roses in the springtime, and how can we avoid them?
Yeah, so with bare root roses, let's start with that. I think that's how most people get their roses in the spring. Couple things. The biggest mistakes is probably mishandling it when it shows up. You leave it out in the box, out in the sun or something like that. You want to get that rose unpacked as quickly as possible. Get it out of that plastic bag. Get yourself a big bucket of water, a garbage can, whatever's got water. You want to just shove that rose down in there. You can put the canes in there as well, but mainly the root system. You want to rehydrate it from its journey. That's in essence what you want to do. And you can leave it in there for about 48 hours, 3 days. If you have to leave it a little longer, maybe change the water is a good idea. But that's the main thing with getting a bare root rose. You want to make sure you get that rose in water and get it set up. Then when you go to planting, you want to give yourself a good sized hole. I don't believe in the 2 foot by 2 foot hole. I believe in amending the entire garden bed. Again, a different conversation. We actually have a video called Creating a Living Soil Profile on the Jackson Perkins YouTube channel, Garden Inspired Living. So you can go there and take a look at that. And then you want to make sure you get the root system kind of spread down in there. Some people will make a mound of soil and kind of put the root system on top of that mound of soil. Mm-hmm. Biggest thing with a bare root rose, and I know this can be controversial sometime, but I'm adamant about this: bury the bud union no matter where you live. People, the bud union is essentially, here's the root system. There's a knot. That's where the canes come out of. You know, if you love the visuals, that's where the canes come out of. And that's the bud union. It's kind of that big knot right there. And you want to bury it. I know some people say in warm climates you don't have to bury it. I believe in burying it. Why? Because when you've got some of the canes in the ground as well, you don't get the wind rock. You just talked about heavy winds in Texas that you guys are experiencing right now.
Literally,
got that single stem. That's gonna. I've seen roses literally torn out of the ground.
Wow.
Yeah. So bury that bud union. That's the biggest thing, and then just water it in really well when you're done. Those are the basic bare root tips. Container rose, a lot simpler to basically, like you would any container plant you buy from a garden center. Dig a hole. You want it maybe twice as big. Do some amendment back, filling an amendment in there. Mm-hmm. Plant it at the soil level that it's in the pot. Okay, that's important as well. Particularly with a lot of own root roses, they'll be in that level. You can certainly bury it a little bit if you feel it's a little bit too high in order to prevent that wind rock. But try to keep the soil level, and then basically, just water everything in really well.
Mm-hmm. I want to take a moment too and say, if you guys have any comments as you're watching, any questions, please drop those in a comment below and we will absolutely be happy to answer those. And Paul, you gave a really great tip before we started the live that I'm embarrassed to admit I have never even thought of. I swear my bare root roses always come on weeks that are like really rainy, too wet to go outside and plant. Yeah. You said you got to just stick it in a pot with some dirt. Mind blowing. I can't believe that's never even occurred to me to do before, just to temporarily put it in a pot and then get it in the ground. And you said even to test the spot of where you want the rose, that you could actually leave it in a pot, for several months and see if it likes a spot. And I thought that was a fantastic tip.
Yeah, it's easy to do. Particularly if you live up north, a lot of times bare root roses, everybody like Jackson Perkins, we try to ship the roses at the optimal time for planting in your part of the world. But sometimes it shows up, you've had a late freeze or a snowfall. You can do a couple of different things. You can't leave it in water forever. You can do what's called healing it in. If you can get like a trench and kind of like dig a trench and then mound soil on top of it. But what I was talking about exactly, we've all got, old pots lying around, black nursery pots or something like that. You can even take, several roses that are bundled together and shove them down into that pot, cover the root system with soil, and just put it in an unheated garage until you can actually get out and plant it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Susan asks, does mulch need to be replaced or can you just add some more on top when you're planting in the spring?
That is a great question, Susan. And it's a little more complicated, but it's actually a very important thing. So let me just break this down a little bit. No pun intended. So I mulch in the spring when I prune. It's the easiest time to get around my garden. Mm-hmm. The video I mentioned earlier, Creating a Living Soil Profile. In essence, what that is, it's all those mycorrhizae and all those little things in there that break down organic matter. They make that available as food for all of the plants in your garden. So what I do is I mulch in the spring, and the following, or I mulch when I prune my roses. Now, a year later, when I go back, if I still have a thick layer of mulch, I know I've got a problem because my soil is not alive. And so I'm actually not happy about that. So I want to be able to mulch every single spring to replace the mulch that's broken down and now become organic matter. Think of the forest floor, the richest soil environment on the planet. Okay. That's because all that stuff decomposes over the year. The new stuff comes back in the fall and falls on it again. I'll give you an example with me. So I had this about 2 years ago. The garden was not doing well. The roses were not growing very well. I just wasn't really happy with them. I did a soil test to check my pH levels, all the basic things that you want to do. But I noticed my mulch wasn't breaking down. It had gotten too thick. It had gotten matted. It was cutting off oxygen. So what I did the following years, I didn't mulch at all. I actually turned it into the soil. And lo and behold, the garden bounced back beautifully. So mulch is a big indicator of soil health. If it's not breaking down, you need to do some soil health issues.
Mm-hmm. And Teresa wants to know, when should she start pruning back my roses? And Teresa, we got to know where in the U.S. you are, or where in the country you are, because that, I guess, I mean, I've already started pruning mine here in Texas. Paul said he's about to start pruning his. So Paul, how do you want to answer that just generally for
Yeah, I
where?
can give you some general ones, and we're going to do. I think it's the last of the three-part series we're about to do. 2 weeks from today is going to be more about pruning. But so a couple different things with pruning. If you have forsythia, which is that beautiful yellow flowered bush, when it starts to bloom, time to prune your roses. If you don't have forsythia, Google your last frost date. You just put in your zip code, last frost date, back up about 6 weeks. That's the time to prune. If you live in a climate like when I lived in Los Angeles with no frost at all, I pruned in December and January. So use the weather to tell you when to prune.
And Teresa, we are also going to have a whole fabulous pruning webinar for you next week. So be sure to join that as well for more.
Yeah, Teresa just chipped in New York. So yeah, Teresa, if you have forsythia, check on that. If not, just take your zip code, Google your last frost date, back up 6 weeks, you're gold.
So let's go back to some pre-planting prep that we might want to be doing this spring. Why is it so important to carefully unpack bare root roses? And what should we look for when we're inspecting the roots and the canes?
Yeah, so unpack them carefully because they are fragile. That's the thing to do. You want to go over the roots and just check the roots out the system, make sure none of the roots are broken. And it's inevitable in packing. That'll sometimes happen. It's not a big deal. Just snip it off, above the break to make sure it's nice and clean. Check the canes, make sure there's no major damage or scratching or anything along those lines. If you do notice something, take a few photographs. It never hurts to document what's going on in case something happens with the rose. Jackson Perkins, like all nurseries, has a good guarantee system for that kind of thing. We want you to succeed, obviously. So those are the things to check out. So just, any kind of damage, cut it off. And that's in essence what you want to look at. So give it an inspection. It's worth doing just to make sure you'll be all right.
And is there an ideal soil or fertilizer or anything that people should be using when they are planting bare root roses?
Yeah, so when you're planting new roses, be they bare root or container, so pH, I've talked about that. That's the level of acidity, easy for me to say, alkalinity in the soil. 6.5 is about right for roses. You can I have a pH meter by a company called Kelway. They're not cheap, $70-$80. But it's the best thing on the planet. If your roses aren't doing well during the year, first thing you do, check your pH level. It's the very first thing you want to look at. But anyway, that's your pH. You want to make sure you got that right. As far as soil mixture, again, I talk about amending the entire bed, that building a living soil profile. I amend a bed with manure, compost, mushroom compost you make yourself, whatever you've got. That's your soil mixture. Now, you can certainly add a little more compost into the hole as you're digging it. But don't get too locked into this. I've got to have this exact ratio of soil mixture. You want to use as much native soil as you can with compost added into it, but hopefully the compost has been in there before, and the mulch that's been breaking down becomes organic matter in the soil.
And I think one of the most important and underrated gardening tips is just location. So can you talk a little bit about how to choose a location for your new rose?
Yeah, so here's the rule of thumb. Roses want full sun up to sundown. That's their ideal situation. Now, this might not be our ideal situation. We may not have that all the time. So you can bend rules a little bit. So, morning sun, afternoon shade, that can work fairly well for roses. I find afternoon or morning shade, afternoon sun doesn't work as well. The less petals a rose has, generally it'll do a little bit better in the shade. And the tip that I was talking about earlier.
I know that.
Yeah, less petals means there's if it's a little bit damp, there's less petals to open up, as opposed to a fully petaled rose.
Okay.
So it has a better chance of opening up. That'll work a little bit with that. And a tip that we talked about earlier that I talked about, if you're not sure about your shade, dappled sun, put the rose in a big pot, like a 3-gallon, 5-gallon pot. Dig a hole where you want it to be the size of the pot. Slip the pot down into the ground. Watch the rose for about a month. And you're going to know if it's happy, if it's greening out and leafing, if it's blooming, if it's growing, it's a happy rose. If it's not doing that, it's not a happy rose. But all you got to do, slip the pot out of the ground and go try it somewhere else. That way you're not having to shock by transplant it all the time.
So clever. And also I want to throw out there too, wet feet. Roses do not love wet feet.
Yep.
So can you talk a little bit about where, like the slopes and maybe where in your own yard might be a good spot for roses?
Yeah, if you've got a high spot in your yard, that's a great spot for roses so the water can shed away. If you have a low spot where the water tends to puddle, horrible spot for roses. They don't like, as you talked about, wet feet. Sometimes if you had an issue like that, you can do a raised bed. You can raise the bed up a little bit. That'll help some with drainage as well. But there's not much you can do to fix drainage issues. If it's a low spot in your garden, don't plant roses there.
And something from our live in August that I thought was so inspiring, that you are so not afraid to rip a plant up and move it to another spot. And I think a lot of people will really wait and just sort of watch something slowly die before they like rip it out and move it. So are you moving any of your own roses this spring? Do you ever experiment in new places and then dig them up?
I don't have any to move this spring, but the answer is yeah, I move them all the time. A lot of times a rose can just be it's not happy in that location. Competition from tree roots, maybe. The wet feet that we talked about, not enough sun. There can be a lot of different things. So if it's sulking and unhappy, go ahead and dig it up and just move it somewhere else. You'll be surprised. Sometimes they'll just go, oh, okay, I like this place.
Like all gardeners, I've been walking around my yard going, where can I fit more plants? And I do feel I have an unused area of my side yard, and I'm definitely going to use your pot trick so that I don't have to commit with some of my new roses. And we'll see.
Yeah, it's a great tip. And a lot of times, actually, I'll plant bare root roses in pots before I even put them in the ground, even if I know it's going to be a sunny spot. I have clay soil in South Carolina. Even though I've amended the heck out of it over the years, it can be a little bit heavy. So, if you find bare root roses don't thrive right out of the gate when you put them in the ground, put them in a pot, grow them on for 3 or 4 months, and then transfer them to the ground when they have a nice, complete root system going.
That's such a good tip.
Yeah, I do that all the time.
Let's see. So when unpacking container roses, what are some of the important signs of a healthy plant versus one that might be struggling out of the box?
Yeah, well, we want to, again, take it out and have a look at it. You can always take the root system and kind of slip it out very gently and make sure that it's okay. But from the top growth standpoint, a couple things for expectations. Keep in mind the rose has just been shipped across wherever far it went in a dark box in a dark truck. It's probably going to lose some leaves. Don't be surprised by that. That's not that big a deal. I wouldn't worry about that at all.
We don't panic about that.
No, you don't panic about leaves. What you do want to watch for, if you start to see some dead growth from the top starting to grow down a little bit and die back a little bit, cut underneath it. But again, take photographs, note it. That's the main thing to look out for. When you get a container rose, instead of planting it right away, I would advise you put it in a place like under a tree or something that gets morning sun, afternoon shade. Give it a week to sort of get over that trip that it's been taking, because that's pretty stressful to be locked in a dark box for sometimes 3, 4, or 5 days.
And even long term, can you talk about why morning sun is preferable over afternoon sun?
Yeah, it just a lot of times the evenings can be moist, particularly if you live in a humid climate like I do, and the rose bloom can't open up because of all that moisture. It needs the sun to dry that bloom off in order to open up. That's the reason why the morning sun is the most important sun of all.
Mm-hmm. And how long can a container rose stay in its pot before planting, and what care does it need during that time?
Yeah, so for a container rose in a pot like this, I'm going to say a 3-gallon pot. That's what most people have access average to. I've kept them in there for 8, 9, 10 months with no trouble whatsoever. Yeah, I mean, and then care is like any other rose. It's some basic fertilizer. Keep an eye on it, deadhead it, clean it up, make sure you clean out dead wood. But in a 3-gallon pot, it can stay for quite a while.
Mm-hmm. Guys, keep commenting and give us your rose planting questions. We'll be here probably for another 10, 15 minutes or so. So definitely hop on and write your comment if you have any questions about planting container or bare root roses.
Susan talks a little bit about, do you prune climbing roses differently than rose bushes? The answer is yes, Susan, but I will go into that when we do the pruning webinar, and I think in 2 more weeks. But
yes,
that's a great question, because there is a huge difference in the way you prune them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you are also such a good resource for your YouTube channel. Goes into a lot of depth about pruning as well.
Yeah, I've got a video called "Pruning Controlling a Climbing Rose." It's an older one. It's not HD, but it talks about the basics. But we will cover that in the pruning, because that's real important to understand a couple basic things.
Let's see, if the roots are circling inside of a container, should we loosen them or cut them before planting?
The answer is yes. You should do something with them. You can cut them. What I'll do sometimes is take my secateurs, my clippers, and I'll kind of score the sides, just like that, in about 4 different spots, almost like a star-shaped pattern. I'm not going in real deep. I'm just going in a little bit, but I'm just trying to sever those outer roots. And by doing that, that stimulates new root growth that will then start to grow out. I wouldn't try to loosen them a lot, because you can end up losing a lot of soil. And since the container plant already has leaves on the top, that could really shock the plant out. But I'll just score them a little bit like that, and just kind of tease the soil loose a little bit with my fingers.
And what are some of the best practices for watering container roses after planting?
Well, water deeply. Anytime you plant anything in the ground or in a container, water completely. I water it till I see water coming out the bottom of the pot. Roses like infrequent deep watering. So if you have roses in containers, don't give them a little drink every single day. Soak them till the water runs out the bottom of the pot, out of the weep holes or whatever you've got underneath there. Then wait, let it dry out for maybe 3 or 4 days, depending on your climate, your sun, etc. But water them till the water runs out the bottom of the pot.
I have actually never planted any sort of tree rose or like a patio rose before. So do you have any tips for, I've been considering, Jackson Perkins has some incredible tree roses that I have my eye on. Do you have any tips for planting and getting some new tree roses and keeping them?
Tree roses are wonderful to have because they add vertical height to the garden. They're really, really pretty sight when they're used in the garden in nice ways. And you can plant other stuff underneath them as well. I do. I mean, like upright perennials or even low growing roses underneath tree roses are really pretty. It's a pretty combination. Yeah. So basically you've got the trunk, you plant it the way you would plant any other rose. So that's no different there. The biggest tip I can give you is get yourself a good stout stake to support that trunk and stake that trunk up because again, you get that wind whipping like that. I've seen them snap, in half.
Oh, that would be
because the trunk's pretty decent size, but it's not big enough to do that. So get yourself a good stout stake, make one out of wood, metal, whatever you can find, but get yourself a good strong stake and make sure that rose is staked tightly against wind.
Yeah. Well, I might just have to try them this spring.
They're fun. I've got about 6 or 7 in my garden in various places. They're just again, so with garden design, because I know we get asked that a lot. A biggest thing with roses tend to grow, particularly floribundas and hybrid teas tend to grow the same height. So when you're planting your garden, you want to think of how can I get vertical interest? How can I take the garden higher? And a tree rose will do that. You talked about your dad making you a pergola. Wonderful way to do something like that. Get the garden up higher with climbing roses. So that's the big thing. You want to vary the height of that garden, and tree roses are really, really good for that. I see too many rose gardens that are just flat, and it's just kind of like.
Yes, I love drift roses for that reason too.
There you go.
The height difference.
Yeah, drift roses are good. I mean, any kind of ground cover, quote unquote, rose. They're really, really good for that kind of thing.
Is there, Gay asks, is there anything we can do to try to prevent rose rosette disease for a new bare root? I think I may have received a plant in the spring that came with rose rosette disease that showed in fall.
Yeah, so again, a little more complicated with the rose rosette disease. It's highly unlikely that the rose arrived with it, mainly because all the bare root roses are grown in California and Arizona, and there is no rose rosette disease out there. So that's and sometimes it could be something else. It could be herbicide drift, can also look exactly like rose rosette disease. How do you prevent it? So you have to understand a couple of things here, and I don't want to get in the weeds on this, but there's actually a YouTube video on my YouTube channel, which is an hour-long interview with 3 experts on rose rosette disease. But essentially, it's a spider mite, a certain mite, a arachnoid mite that basically is blind and cannot fly. It travels on the wind. Okay, that's the thing you have to understand about how this disease is spread. So if you get it in your garden, you want to start walking upwind, and you might find a stand of roses that has rose rosette disease. If they're in a neighbor's yard or something like that, and you can convince them to pull them out or pull them out for them, that's one way to start to help prevent it. The other way to help prevent it is what are called barrier plants. The other thing about the mite that's important to understand, it only lives on a rose. That's the only plant on the planet it can actually live on. So if it falls on anything but a rose, it will die. So if you have, for example, if you go basically upwind and you plant a hedge behind your rose garden upwind, and the mite hits that hedge before it gets into your rose garden, it will die on the hedge and not get into your rose garden. Also, other tall plants within your roses, like buddleias and tall plants, tall perennials like penstemons and things like that. Again, if you have an infected rose and a clean rose over here, and the mite gets blown to the rose, it'll get blown to the rose. If there's a plant that's not a rose in between, blows onto the plant, the mite dies, doesn't spread into the garden.
Such good tips.
Yeah, but the biggest thing with rose rosette disease I can give you, if you have it in your garden and you're pretty certain you've confirmed that you've got it, and certainly my Facebook group, we identify it all the time, get that rose out of the garden as quickly as possible. Don't try to save it. You can't. There's no cure. Yeah.
Also, I want to plug the Paul Zimmerman Roses Gardening, I believe is the name of the Facebook group. Fantastic resource for anyone watching who wants to join that. Love all the activity on your Facebook group.
Yeah, we're a very active group, and we're a group for beginners. I'm very adamant. I've always been about rose beginning, getting people introduced to roses, and rose growers love to make it way too complicated, and we keep it simple and no question too basic. You can ask all your basic questions, and we're there to help you.
Mhm. Flora, beautiful name, asks,
Yeah.
what's the minimum distance to put between 36-inch rose trees?
That's a great question between rose trees.
I'm
So
loving the
Flora, I'm
idea,
going to
Flora,
answer
of like
that.
a row of
Yeah,
roses.
I mean, you can certainly put them, 36 inches apart. If they're going to get 36 inches wide, they'll touch each other. I'm going to tell you, Flora, I would go more by aesthetics.
Mhm.
What looks good in your garden. I think rose trees, if you plant multiple rose trees, I like them kind of spaced equidistant apart.
Mhm.
It's one of the rules that I will have. Normally, I'm not that hard fast rule about that. But if I've got a rose tree and I have another one and it's 8 feet, I'm going to put another one. I put it at 8 feet. But you can certainly plant them. Let's say 4 feet on center. I think would be safe. But anything beyond that is fine as well. But try to get some equidistance. Again, that might be put them in a pot, let them grow out a little bit, and then start putting the pot in various parts of the garden and see what works for your eye. The way your eye travels and moves across the garden.
What tips do you have for keeping roses healthy and disease-free from the very start at planting?
First thing, pick out a rose that grows well in your area.
So important.
And that's the important thing, because not all roses grow in all parts of the country, and that's the important thing to learn
Mhm.
about. So, if you have a local rose society,
Mhm.
Facebook groups, again, we have a lot of people that jump on my group and say, I live in, this area, this town, what roses do well for me.
Mhm.
Local independent garden centers will probably have a pretty decent idea. If you have a local botanical garden that's got roses, do your homework. That's the biggest thing. Find a rose that does well in your area. Outside of that, soil preparation is the most important thing. Make sure the soil is well prepped and well taken care of. A good simple fertilizing program is also important along those lines. If it gets some disease, I'm happy to live with some disease. I know it's certainly in July, I'm going to have it.
Mhm.
It's just the nature of the way it is. I don't sweat it too much, but just basically good nutrition, much like we keep ourselves healthy through a good balanced diet. Same for the roses.
Mhm. And that's such a good point too. Sentimental is always has black spot by summertime, and I don't care because it's one of my favorite roses. It smells so beautiful.
Yeah.
It's worth it, and it will bounce back every single fall.
Yeah, I'm in the upstate of South Carolina in July. I get humid. I mean, that's, the roses almost go
Mhm.
semi-dormant for me in July. They got to
Mhm.
get some black spot. I do a summer cleanup, cut them all back, clean them up. That's when the Japanese beetles come. So I thought, well, they're going to eat them anyway, so I might as well clean them up. But I have
Mhm.
summer blooming perennials. My color in July is actually my perennials.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And to your point about what roses do well for your area, if you guys have not noticed on jacksonperkins.com, you can actually put in, they have a filter for zones. If you don't know what gardening zone you're in, just Google, I'm in Dallas, what zone is Dallas, Texas, and it'll tell you. And then you can put in whatever your zone is, and it'll pop up with some great suggestions for
Yep.
your area, which I think is key. There are even some roses that are bred to be in to tolerate a little bit more of a colder climate. And then there's this fantastic Sunbelt collection. I believe Plum Perfect, one of my favorite roses, I think is in the
Yeah.
Sunbelt
Great
collection.
collection.
It does really, really well for a sunny, hot garden like mine. So definitely something to keep in mind when you're picking out a rose or really any plant, just what does well in
Yeah.
your own
What
area.
does well in your area? Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
And there's two actually trials out there. I should mention that one is called AGRS, American Garden Rose Selections. The other is ARTS, American Rose Trials for Sustainability. Both are chemical free in terms of fungicides, and they are regional. So they're going to have roses that do well and win awards in your region. Just go to their website, AGRS and ARTS, and you will find roses that have been proven to do well in your area under no spray conditions.
Ooh, I know what I'm Googling after this.
That's right. Oh, it's a phenomenal resource. It's such a great, it's only been about 10 years we've had them, and it's just a wonderful thing. It's been a long time coming.
Nice. Now, spring weather can be unpredictable.
Mm.
How should gardeners protect their roses if a late freeze is in the forecast? Such a fear of so many Southern gardeners I know like
Oh,
myself who
we get
think,
it
"Oh,
all.
I'm fine."
No, we get it here. We call it the Easter freeze in like early April, and I've had it. They come through, and the roses are leafing out, and it'll
Mhm.
go. It'll do that, and I'm like, oh, I know I'm going to be dying. I'm going to have dead plants. Um, yeah. So the thing is, let's define freeze first of all. So if it gets below freezing, like 30 degrees, 28 degrees, something like that, for like a couple of hours, that's not a big deal. Don't worry about that. It's when it's going to plunge into the low 20s or lower for like 10, 12, 14, 15 hours. That's when you're going to have some issues. The best thing to do is protect them, and you can just take leaves out of your yard, pile leaves over the top, pile mulch over them, pile soil over them, cover them with blankets. You know, anything to kind of, you know, keep the frost off. You can get frost cloth or something like that. That's the main thing that you can do. It's also the cold wind does more damage sometimes than the cold temperatures. And the other tip I'm going to give you is if you see a rose that seems to have died from a freeze, particularly an own root rose, because own root roses will come back true from the root system, which is one of the reasons I actually do prefer them. The don't dig it out right away. If you have that freeze in April and it looks by the end of April, it looks dead. Give it till like the middle of summer, even July. I've seen roses look dead for like 2 months, and all of a sudden June, July comes around and I've got new growth for the base of the plant. So give it some time.
Love that. That's so true of so many plants too, that they'll, we had everyone calls it snowpocalypse several years ago, and everyone said, you got to take out your cherry laurel because it looked terrible. You couldn't even tell that it's ever had a problem now, several years later.
Yeah. Plants are resilient. They'll take it. They'll take a lot.
Yes. Now, does it matter if someone plants their roses early in spring or later in spring, and what should they consider based on their growing zone?
Well, it's based on where you live, in essence. You know, if you live in, you know, like when I lived in Los Angeles, I could plant all year long. You know, I suspect in Texas, you know, you're probably not all year long, but you're going to have a longer planting season.
I try to plant in the fall, actually, but we all know I cannot resist the spring garden center.
Oh, I know.
So I also plant in the spring, but I try to plant in the fall.
I plant all year, basically, where I am. You know, if you're up north, you know, you definitely want to wait till, you know, your chances of frost or hard freezes are gone. You know, with a bare root rose, you can be a little bit more lenient because it's been in cold storage, so it can handle the cold a little bit more. But with a container plant, you really want to wait till your last freeze date, you know, which you can Google, your last freeze date. And if you are going to get a freeze and you have a container plant leafing out, just put it in an unheated building like a garage. It'll be fine in there.
Do you suggest fertilizing?
I think Katie froze up there. I think the question was fertilizing new roses. I believe in a very light hand when it comes to new roses. I don't believe in fertilizing heavily. I like liquid feeds. We sell a product called Sea Magic, for example, which works extremely well. Katie's having some electrical issues. She's got a windstorm down in Texas. That's what's going on down there. So I believe in some light fertilizing. I think that's really the way to go. Like I said, a liquid feed of some kind is a really good thing to use. Not a big fan of heavy granular feeding in early roses. Again, we want to get those roots established, and a lot of the granular fertilizers have a high nitrogen content. The first number that'll push the top. We don't want to do that. I don't think that's important at all. So I'm going to take some of your questions here. Flora has a question. So weird question. One of the branches on my rose grew to 10 feet. Should I cut and prune it? I potted the rose this year, but bought it 2 years ago. Not a climbing rose, Earth Angel. That's interesting. Okay, so it got to 10 feet. So assuming, Flora, that it bloomed as Earth Angel on the top of that cane, so that means it's not a sucker, which is a rootstock cane that shot up. It can happen sometimes. Roses will sport occasionally. You'll see a different colored bloom, maybe. You might see something like what you saw. In fact, a lot of climbing roses that have a name similar to a rose, like I think Peason is a climbing piece, for example, was actually a sport. So you may have a rose that sported and want to be a climbing rose. That being said, just cut it back like any other cane. Don't worry about it. You'll be fine with what it is there. So that'll be fine there. Let's see. We had the rose rosette, minimum distance for trees. Feeding new roses. Hang on, folks. Just kind of fielding questions here. How close to plant roses? Garden design. Fabulous question. Let me talk about that here just a little bit. Hello, you back?
I'm so sorry. I told y'all I have some crazy weather happening in Dallas.
Yeah, I told everybody about your weather.
Completely died, and I lost power and internet.
That's okay. Now I told everybody that was going on, so we got it. We've been kind of punting here is what we're doing. So I'm going to talk about how close to plant roses and garden design. That was a question that came up, was mailed into us. So a lot of it's going to be objections. So like if you exhibit roses, you want to plant them far apart because you need to be able to get around and work them. Okay, but I don't exhibit. When I design gardens, which I do, I want my roses to basically touch each other but not grow into each other. That's the thing that I really want to do because I want to see roses. I don't want to see mulch. I don't want a mulch garden. I want a rose garden. So if your rose grows, for example, you have roses that grow 36 inches across. So that means the middle is here, and they're going to grow 1.5 feet in each direction to equal a 3-foot spread. So that's 36 inches. I take maybe 10% off, and that's how close I'll plant them. So at 36 inches, I'll plant them maybe 35 inches on center. That way the outer branches can just touch each other. But not grow into each other, and that gives me that nice mass effect. When I move to a different variety, maybe a little bit more spacing. I also want to make sure I've got spacing so I can move through the garden, walk, do the chores I need to do the activities that I need to do. That's the important thing. So that's essentially the spacing. Get the mature width, back about 10% off, and then that's your spacing to get that nice full effect that goes with that. But do leave yourself occasionally room, pathways, so you can maneuver through the garden to do the chores you need to do.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
All right, I'm so sorry, guys. I'm so sorry. Okay, so we're gonna wrap up here in just a minute too, and I don't want to stop if you would just if I missed this while I was out. Did you already talk about common myths about planting roses?
Yeah, common myths. I talked about the 2 by 2 foot hole, which I think is just ridiculous. Mend the entire bed. That's the feeling I get about it. That way, I don't have to dig a hole as big as the plant itself. I mentioned I have heavy clay soil. We've been on our farm now for 25 years. We have horses, so I mend the soil. If I go out in my lawn, for example, I can't get a shovel more than an inch into the ground. If I go into my garden, I can get a hand shovel about 2 foot deep. So that's just years and years of amending the soil. That's an important thing to do. That's the other one we talked about with bare root roses. Planting the bud union above the ground. I very much disagree with that. Bury the bud union 1 to 2 inches is all you need to bury it. That's the other myth that I would get away with. And we talked about fertilizing earlier a little bit. I did talk about not fertilizing new roses a lot. Liquid feed at most. Get the roots going first. Don't worry about the tops. Just get the roots going too. And I want to go back to Christy got a question about mulch. Do you mulch right up to the rose base or leave a small gap? Leave a small gap. Yeah, you don't want that moisture right up against the base trunk of the rose or the canes of the rose. So leave a bit of a gap. Great question, Christy. Thanks for asking that one.
Absolutely. Now, once roses are planted, what does good care look like for the first few weeks when you get a brand new rose? And are there any kinds of stress that people should watch for?
Yeah, so the care for a brand new rose, even for the first season, is actually as minimal as possible. I talked about, a liquid feed like Sea Magic or something like that. I think that's a seaweed-based fertilizer or fish-based fertilizer. That's a real good.
Uh-oh. Did we lose Paul now? Oh gosh. What a live. What a live. Well, guys, we are also going to do a pruning workshop next week. So I see we've had quite a lot of pruning questions today, and we're going to do a whole live chat. It is supposed to be gorgeous weather next Tuesday, so hopefully we can have a no connectivity issues.
I'm back.
Aren't we a pair?
I know. We've got this really nice going in and out zooming thing going on.
This is getting exciting.
I'm back. I have no idea what happened. I didn't have power go out or anything. So,
Wild.
Yeah.
I was just telling them we're going to do a pruning workshop next Tuesday, and to be sure to join for that because we are hopefully also going to have better weather, but also a really in-depth chat about pruning for our second workshop in our rose growing series.
Yeah, we'll be able to do that.
Paul, any more just quick tips for people to consider when they're getting new roses this spring?
Yeah, just, when the new roses arrive, like we talked about, inspect them, take a good look at them. If you do notice something wrong, take a photograph, maybe call the nursery you came from. Jackson Perkins, we got a good call center. That way you're on the record as having, said something about it. Take pictures, put them on Facebook groups if you have an issue. Other than that, just, get them in the ground when you feel you can. If you can't, put them in a pot. If they're a bare root rose, if it's a container rose, unheated garage until you can actually plant it. And then the biggest advice for new plants is a very light hand the first year. Let the plant settle in. Don't try to force it by force feeding a lot of fertilizer into it.
And do you prune the next spring, or do you wait?
I generally do a light hand the next spring as well in the first year, after that first year of growth. Look for dead growth, that kind of stuff. You always want to be sure you're cutting that kind of stuff out. Yes. And that's normal to get that kind of thing. But I like a light hand the first year in pruning. Just, maybe no more than the third, just shape it up a little bit.
And one last question, Flora asks, how often is it okay to put eggshells in the soil?
Yeah, eggshells is calcium. It's organic material. It's not a bad idea. What I would advise before anybody starts adding anything to the soil is get a soil test. Your local Master Gardener Center, a lot of universities will do them. They're not expensive. It'll tell you exactly what's going on in your soil. It'll tell you your pH, nutrients you have too much of, nutrients you're going to need to add. So, before you add them, like you always heard thing about, put bone meal in the bottom of the hole. Well, if you've got too much phosphorus already, that's a huge mistake. So you want to know what's going on in your soil. I say it's like going to the doctor. You don't go to the doctor and say, I'm sick. And the doctor looks and goes, well, try this medicine. Let's see if that'll help. No, they do a diagnosis first, figure out what's wrong with you, then pick the medication. Same with your soil. Get a soil test. I actually get one every 2 or 3 years. I don't do it just once. And that tells you what you're going to need. So it's okay to put eggshells, but before you add anything, get yourself a soil test.
Well, Paul, thank you so much. I love learning from you. I can talk about roses all day. Tell everybody listening one more time where they can find you on social media and your website.
Yeah, my website's paulzimmermanroses.com, social media, Instagram. It's Paul Zimmerman Roses Design and Consulting. The Facebook group is Paul Zimmerman Roses Gardening. But my website, if you go there, you'll sort of, that's sort of central and then sort of hubs out from there, I guess.
Awesome. And everyone, again, I am Katie Rose from The Rose Table. If you want to see all the roses in my garden, you can go to therosetable.com, click on the gardening tab, and then roses. I also love a good garden party. If you love that sort of inspiration, you can find The Rose Table on social media. And please join me and Paul next Tuesday for our pruning workshop. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you. Happy rosing, everyone.